Hello, my name is Garrett, and I'm creating this video to make the claim that the Pretty Things deserve to be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Someone might ask themselves, who the hell are the Pretty Things? And well, you'd have a good reason for that because they didn't have any hits in the US. They only had two top 20 hits in the UK. So some might ask, why does this band deserve to rub shoulders with Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, Van Morrison, The Who, Pink Floyd, David Bowie, Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, The Stooges, the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, the Clash? Why do they deserve to be in the same company as these people when they didn't have hardly any hits whatsoever? Well, because that list of names I just said, they were all impacted or influenced by the Pretty Things directly in many cases. So let's dig into it. Now, gold records, number one hits, and million sellers are not really appropriate standards for evaluation according to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So just the fact they didn't have much commercial success should not matter. However, what does matter is the band has to be within the 25 or outside the 25-year window. The Pretty Things are. They started in 1964. Candidates are reviewed and discussed relative to their impact on this music that we broadly call rock and roll. The innovation and influence of these artists is also critical. So I feel like this is where the Pretty Things are a no-brainer because they have three things I think of when I think of influence. It's influence on artists, it's innovation in music, being the first to create something or a genre, and then you have the rock and roll lifestyle. Now, rock and roll lifestyle is going to be the easy one, so I might as well start with it. Phil May had the longest hair of all of the British rock bands, or all the rock bands, really. He was well before his time. They were considered the bad boys of the British scene, more so than the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones kind of stole that clout. I wouldn't say stole it. However, the Rolling Stones had a year under their belt before the Pretty Things had their first record. When that first record came out, which is called Rosalind was the punkiest song that you could find at the time. This is before You Really Got Me by the Kinks. Rosalind was a huge, not a huge success because it was only a number 41, I think, on the charts in the UK. However, Jimmy Page is a huge fan of this record. The Clash practically covered this song in a song called Hateful. It almost sounds exactly the same in my opinion. And also, Rosalind is the oldest track on the Nuggets 2 box set, which is all about the proto-punk stuff. So very, very influential, very before its time. Also, it gave them the clout that they were for the younger crowd. The Rolling Stones in '64 were more for the older crowd, which wasn't great for Mick Jagger. Mick Jagger didn't like that. So when the Pretty Things played the Ready Steady Go show in Britain, Mick Jagger's quoted as saying, he's too effing pretty, he's dangerous. He was talking about Phil May and how he was stealing that bad boy thunder from the band, from the Rolling Stones. So him and his management, the Rolling Stones, threatened to never show up on the show if they ever had the Pretty Things on again, and that worked. So the Pretty Things did not get a lot of TV time, at least not on that show. So there was a reason for that. Now, the Rolling Stones actually are kind of the reason the Pretty Things existed, because Dick Taylor was originally in a band with Keith Richards and Mick Jagger. But Dick Taylor didn't want to go from guitar to bass in order to stay with them, so he left the band, met Phil May in art school, and then they formed the Pretty Things. They were about a year behind the Rolling Stones as far as like first album, first single, and whatnot. So easiest one next would be David Bowie. David Bowie in the early days, after Rosalind. Rosalind is actually the first song on David Bowie's Pinups album in 1973, and there's another Pretty Things song, which was their next single called Don't Bring Me Down, that's on that Pinups album. David Bowie was in concert, front and center. He has Phil May in his little black book of the time, and it says Phil May is God. And he was definitely taking notes, especially the fact that Phil May was way before his time in a huge way, that he was basically changing gender pronouns to songs. Phil May himself was bisexual, and actually Don't Bring Me Down, their second single and their biggest hit, by the way, has a line in it, and the line was supposed to be, "I need a lover, someone new, and to her I will be true." Listen to the song, look it up, because I'm pretty darn sure he says, "And to him I will be true." This is way before its time. I can't think of any other time that the point of view was there was a gay point of view, basically, whereas other songs prior, like Jailhouse Rock by Elvis, were more jokey when they incorporated such things. And David Bowie also would later record 2 songs that he released as singles that had the Pretty Things in the very title. In 1971, "Oh You Pretty Things." That is not a coincidence. And then 1999, he had a song called "The Pretty Things Are Going to Hell." Beyond that, let's keep on trucking. Bob Dylan. This is an interesting one. I wish I could ask Bob Dylan how much influence this band had on him. In 1964, after "Don't Bring Me Down" came out and it was their big hit, the next song that they had the potential to cover was Mr. Tambourine Man. This is before the Byrds did it. They had exclusive rights. Pretty Things had exclusive rights to record this before anyone else. And Phil May and company didn't want to do it. The manager was trying to push it, but they didn't want to do it. So they were rebels to the end. They shot themselves in the foot a lot of times. However, Bob Dylan must have respected this, because after that, of course, the Byrds created the folk rock, anthem, Mr. Tambourine Man, which the Pretty Things almost have a hand in not doing a song. But Bob Dylan must have respected the Pretty Things for refusing, because in 1965, when Bob Dylan finally went electric, when he went electric for a full album, which was Highway 61 Revisited, he started with "Like a Rolling Stone." After that snare beat, we have one of the great rock songs of all time. The song after that is a song called "Tombstone Blues." The first line of that song is, "The sweet pretty things are in bed, of course." This, again, is not a coincidence. He knew who the Pretty Things were. This is one of the few times Bob Dylan referenced an artist within a lyric, maybe the only time, because "Like a Rolling Stone" was not about the Rolling Stones. Also, if you watch the documentary "Don't Look Back," you will see Brian Pendleton as part of Bob Dylan's entourage, and Brian was the Pretty Things guitarist. So I always wonder how much influence the Pretty Things had on Bob Dylan going electric, as far as the attitude. Beyond that, the Easy Beats. The Easy Beats, if you don't know the name the Easy Beats, fine. However, you know AC/DC. If it wasn't for the Easy Beats, AC/DC would not exist. George Young was in the band. That is Malcolm and Angus's brother, older brother. And the Easy Beats, when they started out in Australia, because the Pretty Things, again, shot themselves in the foot, they didn't tour the U.S. They went to New Zealand and Australia, and they would have been much more successful if they didn't do that. However, they did influence that whole scene, and the Easy Beats were quoted in the liner notes of one of my collections, the Definitive Collection, saying they didn't want to be the Beatles, they didn't want to be the Rolling Stones, they wanted to be the Pretty Things. And Van Morrison is quoted as saying, "One of the greatest R&B bands of all time." Real wild. Around this time, "Don't Bring Me Down," they had another song that came out called "Roadrunner." It's a great cover, probably my favorite cover of Roadrunner. And Aerosmith would cover Roadrunner on "Honkin' on Bobo," the first song on their cover album. And again, I think this was patterned after the Pretty Things version, because when May met Steven, according to Phil May, he said, "So I went into this VIP room with all these stars around, and as I got to the door, Steven saw me, came over and got down on his knees." So Aerosmith was a fan, or at least Steven Tyler was a fan. Around this time, they also put out a song called "Midnight to Six Man." And this song would be name-checked in a song by The Clash. So the very first line of "White Man in Hammersmith Palace" is that title, "Midnight to Six Man." And this is a garage rock classic, which, again, at this point, they were not selling records. They were outside of the top 40, even though they were coming up with amazing before its time garage rock. "LSD" is another song that came out. It was a B-side, really. It was done as a demo initially, but it was definitely one of the first songs to kind of tease the censors in that way. And there was a music video for it in 1966, which is really before its time, too. Now, around this time, this music, this garage rock, Joey Ramone would reflect on later. This album right here, that album right there, it's actually a 2-record collection. It's a compilation of the first 3 albums by the Pretty Things. Joey Ramone had about 65 records in his collection. Only that many, and they actually sold them, I believe, on eBay after he died. This is one of his collection, and he's quoted as saying, "I've always wanted to meet Phil May. The Pretty Things were the biggest influence on us. Like right at the start when there were the Beatles and the Stones and stuff, we would hear about the Pretty Things and just pick up the odd record, but they were so wild they invented garage bands." He also is later saying, yeah, they were the biggest influence on us. That's incredible. But it doesn't even stop there, because you also have the Sex Pistols and the Clash. Johnny Rotten and Mick Jones, their first concert was a Pretty Things concert when they were around 12 or 13. I think both of their moms dragged them there to see them. Matlock of Sex Pistols said they were pretty seminal, and Johnny Rotten said he preferred the Pretty Things to the Stones. And beyond that, so that Pretty Things really, you know, they did a lot in the early years just because of their perception as being the bad boys, as far as being louder and raunchier than the Rolling Stones. And they could have stayed in that avenue. They also influenced Iggy Pop and the Stooges. First time Iggy Pop met Phil May, Iggy Pop headbutted a wall and then bled all over Phil May as he danced with him. So it's an interesting little tidbit there. However, they could have just stayed in that avenue, but they didn't. That is not all their influence. In fact, by the time their hits dried up in 1966, Brian Pendleton and John Stax left the band. And this is usually where most bands would fall apart, but in my opinion, it only got better, because Wally Waller joined the band, and then they would enter a new era, and this era would be very much psychedelic. The Pretty Things may have the first psychedelic song of all time. In 1965, there were not a lot of records that you could point to and say that's psychedelic. Like, to me, Norwegian Wood, no, I'm sorry, that's just an Eastern instrument added to a folk song. The ones that are debatable, Still I'm Sad by the Yardbirds, which is mid-1965. And then you have, I'm forgetting it. Still I'm Sad. Oh, See My Friends by the Kinks. Now, Still I'm Sad is almost not rock, because there's no real rock beat, so I wouldn't call it psychedelic rock. It's psychedelic, yes. See My Friends is almost not psychedelic enough. In December 1965, the Pretty Things released their sophomore album, and on it was a song called Can't Stand the Pain. Listen to this song. It has a sound that's familiar to a song on the Doors' first album. In my opinion, even the lyrics, I think, are psychedelic. But it wouldn't stop here. It would continue with what I consider the best British psychedelic rock singles of all time. Defecting Grey is a mini suite. So like Good Vibrations, except less pop, more psychedelic. And then you have a single after it talking about the good times and Walking Through My Dreams. Both of them amazing. But they were actually created so that the band could take a year's time to create an album. Before this time, they had 3 albums. The third one was actually just a contract obligation album called Emotions, and the label put horns on it, which they didn't like, but they were just doing it to get it over with. Although I will say this: look up a song called "The Sun," the Pretty Things. That is on that album. A great track, in my opinion. However, the Pretty Things were taking their time on their next album. They wanted to do something different. And Wally Waller said when he listened to Sgt. Pepper for the first time, he was disappointed because he thought it was going to have a story, and it didn't have a story. So he told his bandmates, hey, let's create an album that has a story to it. Phil May had written a little short story And so he basically turned the short story into the album, and this album was going to have a story told throughout it. Now, there are no other rock operas before this time. A lot of people point to a 60s band, not the 90s band, a 60s band called Nirvana. And that album, it does not have a story. I would claim it's silly at best. It's disconnected. So SF Sorrow was the album that appeared. This is SF Sorrow right over here in 1968. It came out before Tommy. Tommy is often regarded as the first rock opera, and that is way off the mark. In fact, this album probably came out before Pete Townsend had written Pinball Wizard. And if you listen to the track Old Man Going on the SF Sorrow album, it sounds a lot like the beginning of Pinball Wizard. So absolutely, I do think this had a huge bearing on Tommy. Pete Townsend refuses to admit it now, but all signs say that they were. Also, Keith Moon's inspiration. Keith Moon's biggest idol at the time was Vivian Prince. Vivian Prince was the Pretty Things drummer, who was even more of a lunatic than Keith Moon. He lit a fire on a New Zealand bound plane. He's one of the few he claims was kicked out of the Hells Angels. I don't know how much all of this is true. The first time that Paul McCartney dropped acid, it was with Viv Prince. But Keith Moon absolutely idolized Vivian Prince, and that was his. More drums around him, more lunatic than anyone else. So let's continue. So that's the Who for the most part, who are friends of the band. Also, hey, Pink Floyd. David Gilmour, when the Pretty Things recorded first time on doing the entire album SF Sorrow in 1998, so this is 30 years later. They did it for an internet performance, which is also kind of ahead of its time. The Rolling Stones had already done one just a few years prior as far as internet. And David Gilmour played on that album. David Gilmour also played on other recordings, and you could really hear the Syd Barrett era in the SF Sorrow album and the next album that the Pretty Things were going to create, which I'll get to in a sec. And John Lennon, John Lennon. SF Sorrow was very much also inspired by the fact that John Lennon wanted to show the Sgt. Pepper album to somebody, but who? So he found Phil May at a bar, dragged him, to his house or whatever, played this album, and this had a huge bearing on the psychedelic sound of SF Sorrow. According to Wikipedia, Old Man Going and I See You is claimed to have some precursors to heavy metal. I'm not quite sure. I could kind of hear it, but I can hear it in a lot of other Pretty Things songs too, like Alexander. Continuing. So, Jim Morrison, The Doors. Jim Morrison was a fan around this time. He saw a performance of SF Sorrow, or at least some of the songs. Jimi Hendrix was a friend of the band. In fact, him and Phil May were sharing a girlfriend. So I do think that their presentation and their rock performances had a bearing on Jimi Hendrix when he was living in Britain before he made it huge and went back to the U.S. So there's a jump cut here. The reason is the battery died on my camcorder. I wanted to do this all in one cut, just to show, that I hope I know what I'm talking about. Sometimes when people cut, I feel like they're not passionate enough to know what they're talking about. So they have to go back to the script, come back, jump cut, jump cut, jump cut. There's a lot of that on YouTube. So we're going to continue where we left off. SF Sorrow over here, I recommend listening to. SF Sorrow is the first rock opera, well before Tommy. And although it was released after Tommy in the US, which is one reason why people have a misnomer that Tommy was the first rock opera. SF Sorrow is also probably the most depressing 60s album I could think of, just because of the linear progression of this character. He's born, he loses his girlfriend in a air balloon disaster like the Hindenburg, he goes to war, he sees a lot of death, and then he walks the earth alone. That is the album. It's very nihilistic, amazingly so. Pink Floyd, I would believe were inspired by that. But the most direct inspiration is the next album. It's not really actually the next album, because the Pretty Things have this weird progression where, to make ends meet, because none of their albums were selling anything, they had to moonlight as a different band called Electric Banana. Electric Banana right here. That's a compilation of 5 mini albums that the Pretty Things created for something called DeWolf Library, Film Library. And that means they donated songs that they don't even get rights to, just to get some cash so they can continue recording, they can continue living. These are tracks that you will hear in movies and TV. The Street Girl was in a car ad. 1,000 Ages from the Sun was in Better Call Saul. So there's a lot of episodes and whatnot, and movies that have songs, these songs in them. And then in 1969, they had an album that was financed by a French millionaire named Philippe Debarge. Right here. This wasn't released until much later. There's only 2 or 3 acetates, I think, for like 30 years before it was finally released on CD. Basically, a French millionaire asked the band to record harmonies, the instruments, and everything, and have him sing. Well, the problem is he was French and he didn't speak English, so he had to learn everything phonetically. It's a really great album, but I wouldn't call it a legit part of the canon, so to speak. So the next album, according to the canon, is Parachute, 1970. There's a misnomer that this won the best rock album of Rolling Stone magazine, 1970, and that's not actually true. However, in my opinion, it should have. This is top 10 album for me. This is sort of like, what if the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Pink Floyd all had a baby? Lou Reed too. I put Lou Reed in there as well. And Parachute starts with scene 1. If you listen to this, you will be reminded of the slow swell of music of Dark Side of the Moon. David Gilmour says that he said a few things. He said the Pretty Things always made the Stones look lame, and then he also said that Parachute, this album, had a direct influence on Dark Side of the Moon. You could hear it on that track. You could hear it on a lot of tracks. When I listened to Cries from the Midnight Circus, a great track, and the one that the Blur, I think the guitarist of Blur, after Phil May died, he said in a tweet, he said, listen to Cries from the Midnight Circus. An amazing song that it sounds like money, in my opinion. So a lot of influence there with Pink Floyd, and I believe that SF Sorrow and Parachute would influence The Wall later. So the band basically influenced, also was, appreciated or influenced by the Kinks, Alice Cooper. Alice Cooper's first album was called Pretty's For You. I always wanted to ask, Alice Cooper, I mean, is that a Pretty Things reference? Little Steven and Bruce Springsteen, they would go to concerts. Little Stevie was like a huge fan. Kurt Cobain was a fan of this band. Oasis was a fan of this band. The White Stripes were a fan of this band. And Radiohead is an interesting one because, okay, Radiohead was obviously influenced by Pink Floyd, and Pink Floyd was influenced by the Pretty Things. But that's like a second-hand influence. If you listen to a song on Parachute called In the Square, listen to the whole thing. It's only about 2 minutes long. You will be reminded of the What's That section of Paranoid Android. I want to ask Tom York if that was a direct inspiration right there, because it sounds exactly the same. So this band, had an influenced hard rock. It influenced punk big time. Heavy metal, according to Wikipedia. Power pop, just because Easy Beats, influencing the Easy Beats, in my opinion, is they were the first power pop band, and then influenced AC/DC and that whole scene. Folk rock, just by refusing Mr. Tambourine Man and maybe inspiring Bob Dylan to go electric, or a little bit of that sound. Glam rock, because of David Bowie. Psychedelia, because of the first psychedelic song I mentioned, and SF Sorrow in general. Progressive rock, rock operas, concept albums, they have all of this influence, and they weren't even done yet. We've only gone 6 years into their existence, 64 to 1970. they would continue. Their influence may be not as deep, but they would go more of a hard rock route for the next one. They would get a guitarist named Pete Tolson, who Jimmy Page considers the great unsung guitarist. And Pete Tolson, October 26th, look up that song too. That's a great solo at the end. Would stay with the band. When they were then signed, the second band signed to the Swan Song label. So after Bad Company, Jimmy Page and Robert Plant signed The Pretty Things for 2 albums. And the funny thing is, you look up Swan Song Records on Wikipedia, and Jimmy Page isn't talking about Bad Company. He doesn't talk about, the band that actually sold records for them. He's talking about 2 quotes, I believe, where he's talking about The Pretty Things and how awesome their records were. John Bonham was a huge fan of The Pretty Things, so much so that he smashed a glass door when it was interrupting listening to a vinyl record of The Pretty Things' latest. So a lot of influence there with Led Zeppelin. Arthur Brown is quoted as saying, "They've been the role models for their generations of weak, pale imitations, the on-the-road excesses of the 70s tamed rock gods, the formless pantomime of the Sex Pistols punk, the pathetic foot-stamping of Oasis and Britpop pansies. They invented everything and were credited with nothing." Now, that's a big statement. I don't even think the Beatles invented everything. It's funny how close The Pretty Things get to inventing nearly every change or almost every artist in the 60s and the 70s. I was looking online, and there was a ranking. The top 100 influential artists post Beatles. 7 of the top 8 were influenced by The Pretty Things. 11 of the top 16. It's amazing how many people they had contact with and are not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So I ask you, how many huge, great bands were influenced by Steve Miller Band? Because they're in it. There's so many bands that have been put in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame just because they had a lot of hits, and they're really scraping the barrel at this point. Sorry, Steve Miller fans, but they didn't influence a lot. They had records, sure. They had hit records, sure. But does that mean they have a place in the Hall of Fame before The Pretty Things, who influenced all the artists I just went through? I say no to that. If the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame really truly believes that it doesn't matter how much they sell, it's all about the influence on rock, on the sound, on the other rock musicians, on the lifestyle, The Pretty Things are a shoe-in. They should have been in a long time ago. The Pretty Things ended in 2020, basically, when Phil May died at the age of 75. It's interesting because after the Swan Song label, they had a great new wave power pop album in 1980 called Crosstalk. And then when that didn't sell, because Warner Brothers actually printed the same side on both sides of the record. Where's the record? There it is, that's Crosstalk. But anyways, both sides of the vinyl had the same sound on it, and so they had to recall it. And by that point, it was all deflated. So, yeah. And so the band broke up, and they broke up for about 19 years. That's a long time. It's 2 decades, basically. And then they came back with an album, Rage Before Beauty. And then they had a follow-up to that album in 2007, another one in 2015, and they had one in 2020. These 4 albums, I think, are better than anything the Rolling Stones or any other 60s band has done that late in the game. So the Pretty Things have... despite only really having like 12 albums canon, they had a lot of music beyond that. The Electric Banana stuff just being one of them. Phil May had an album he did with Fallen Angels, which is great, in 1978. There's a lot of material outside of the canon albums. And if you want to hear some of those songs, you want to hear what a lot of the ones I've name dropped, I recommend going through my Pretty Things list of videos, because I have a ton of them. I have Electric Banana stuff, you want to hear it. I have a ton of different ways that you could listen in a linear progression to this band. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you listen to a few. And the Pretty Things are not even in the conversation to join the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame on most sites. And I think that is a shame and a sham. So let's not make it the Rock and Roll Hall of Shame. Let's put them in it.